Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
Hello, it's Faisal in the Newscast studio.
Also joining us is filmmaker extraordinaire Jane Corbin. Welcome back.
Thank you and hello.
And also in our Washington studio is our chief North America correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Adam. Hi.
Right, we're parking British domestic politics and focusing on big international stories around the world. And the first thing we're going to look at is these negotiations underway in Geneva right now. Or, well, we think they might have actually paused while we're recording them, between the US and Iran. Although, first of all, Gary, these are not negotiations where they're all sat around a table. They're these indirect talks, aren't they, where they're all in different rooms.
That's right. And the Omanis are the intermediaries in these negotiations. So you've got Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff from the US side. You've got the Omanis, and then you've got the Iranian foreign minister. And they've been shuttling back and forward. They had a big session early Thursday morning. They're having this bit of a break while we're recording now, and they should be doing some more after that and trying to hammer out some kind of deal to prevent Donald Trump from taking, as they like to call it here at the Pentagon and elsewhere, kinetic action.
In other words, a war or some kind of military strike.
Brute force, yeah.
Jane, as somebody who's covered that region for a long time, are you just thinking, here we go again? It's Iran's nuclear program and there's negotiations and they don't seem to be going anywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, this time, Trump has built up the biggest armada that we've seen in a couple of decades in the Middle East. You know, the aircraft carriers, strike aircraft, and it's a massive flotilla. But it can only be kept on station for so long. So every day that goes by, I think, ramps up the pressure. But yes, of course, the nuclear negotiations have been going on for decades. And it was Trump, of course, who originally withdrew the previous deal.
Which Obama had done.
Which Obama had done. And I think that what the message, as Gary was saying, what we're getting from the Iranian officials is they're almost there in having an agreement. But what is the agreement? Because the hardliners on the Trump side, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Defense Secretary Hegseth, they would like to include ballistic missiles, which carry so-called putative nuclear weapons, in the deal. And, that's something, the Iranians absolutely don't want to go there. They do not want to put that into the pot for negotiation. And in fact, they are basically saying that, yes, we have no intention of having a nuclear weapon. We never had, but we will not give up our rights to harness nuclear technology for peaceful reasons. So that's where they're standing on this.
And Gary, it is quite unusual for it to be so unclear what the Americans are actually asking for here. Is it Iran's nuclear program and how much uranium they enrich? Or is it, as Jane says, the ballistic missiles to deliver a nuclear weapon? Or is it even their support for other groups around the region like Hezbollah?
Well, look, there are unquestionably mixed messages coming out of this administration. You have Donald Trump, not just last year, but at the State of the Union earlier this week, saying Iran's nuclear capabilities had been obliterated. So you might think, well, why do we need to discuss it at all? Yet you also have Steve Witkoff, the envoy, saying they could be within a week of producing weapons-grade materials. So, which is it? Now, the Americans do also believe, like Jane was saying, that they want to discuss ballistic missiles because they argue that that's not just a regional thing anymore, a threat to Israel and other stability in the region, but also a potential threat to the US homeland. So it's a sort of homeland issue as well. And that's why they want to put ballistic missiles on the agenda, as well as Iran's, general support for its proxies in the region. All that being resisted, as Jamie said, by the Iranians, who also want to talk about sanctions coming off. So there's a lot of places in which there is not a meeting of minds on paper at the moment. But I think if the Americans can get to a sort of base camp on some kind of nuclear deal, they will take that for the time being, even if Israel doesn't like it being that narrowly drawn.
And Jane, why are we talking about Hezbollah so much again as one of these Iranian regional proxies? Because didn't Israel sort of take them out last year?
To a certain extent, yes, but it's understood that Hezbollah still retains a big arsenal of rockets and missiles, largely supplied by Iran, or the technology supplied by Iran. And I think the fear is in Israel, and certainly Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister there, has sought to pressurize Trump to come on side with him, not just on nukes and ballistic missiles, but on the proxies, the issue of Hezbollah, because Israel is concerned that if Trump and the Americans strike Iran, they will bear the brunt of it because all those Hezbollah Hezbollah missiles that are still underground will be coming over the border at them. And again, we haven't really seen, in the past we've seen Trump and Netanyahu's aims quite closely aligned on Iran. But this time there is a little bit more of a distance, and we're not seeing quite so much closeness between them. So Israel, it's very important for Israel what kind of a deal is done. And if it's just about the nuclear issue, it doesn't make the long-term problem go away.
And Gary, Jane used the word armada, which is the word Trump has used to describe the massing of the American military in the region. Just how big is this so-called armada? I mean, is it true there's 2 aircraft carriers are going to be there shortly?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, and bear in mind, an aircraft carrier doesn't just sail away on its own. It has a whole sort of fleet of support ships, destroyers, other things that go with it. They call it a strike group. It's a massive flotilla, and there are 2 of them, out there now. There's the Gerald R. Ford, which is the country's newest aircraft carrier, its biggest aircraft carrier, and the Abraham Lincoln is also there. This is, 30 or 40% of America's kind of naval capacity, naval flex, if you like, over there. So the threat is enormous. Now, that can, of course, produce results at the negotiating table. It can put pressure on, but also it can look like, a bit of a paper tiger if you choose not to use it. So there's this huge balance for Donald Trump here of how much he builds up and how far he's prepared to go and what his red lines are. And we're just not very clear what will actually make up his mind. He said earlier in the week, look, they just have to say the words. Well, they've been saying the words for some time, so it's not clear that would be enough to convince him not to have another crack at them.
And Faisal, I can imagine some people thinking, okay, here we go again, but Iran is a long way away. They're not threatening the UK. Who knows what will actually come out of these talks? But actually, there is a global economic impact of all of this. Even just the uncertainty has an impact.
Well, the uncertainty has an impact. We've already seen oil prices go to a kind of 7-month high on the speculation. Well, it's not speculation, the reality of what's just been described. It kind of cuts both ways, though. I mean, clearly, if there was a major war there, the great fear in economic terms, which is parking the sort of human issue here, but in economic terms, is that you get a disruption to the oil supplies, not just the oil supplies, but to the gas supplies out of the Gulf, and in particular the Strait of Hormuz that is just between. Just sort of south of Iran is easily blocked, just a couple of dozen miles wide at the shortest point. And then you block off a good proportion of the world's oil supply and also its gas supply, which increasingly comes on ships from the likes of Qatar. Now, we've talked about this a number of times. We talked about it, of course, I think probably anybody here would have thought this time last year when there was the prospect of an exchange of missiles between Tehran and Tel Aviv, that would have sparked that type of chaos in the oil markets and indeed chaos in oil supply. It turned out that it sort of the markets went up and then everything was fine.
Yeah.
So they've sort of the benign economic implications of what was seen as very much as the worst case scenario have been the feature of the past few months. This may actually answer the question about why there are 2 aircraft carriers there, because if there is any kinetic action, as Gary puts it, that's the sort of presence that might maintain the flow of oil and gas through the straits, no matter what the Iranians
so you could you could use a part of your armada to strike, and then the rest of it to keep the global economy going.
But this does really matter. We are, because of what's happening in Russia, with we don't get supplies of gas through pipelines from Russia anymore. Europe is increasingly dependent on shipped gas. Even if it's physically coming through, the price that is set in international markets is determined by overall supplies. So yeah, that is the knock-on impact at a time of other fragility in world markets as well around tech shares and things like that. So delicate, but I'm wary that we will have had this conversation a year ago. And if, to be honest, you told me that there was going to be missiles landing in Tehran and missiles landing in Tel Aviv, I'd have said, well, the oil price is going to go to $200 a barrel.
But it
didn't happen.
Strangely sort of contained last time round, didn't it?
Well,
and it seemed like each side was telling the other what they were going to do to let them do it.
And I'm left a bit confused. I mean, Gary raised this question, and I'm like, what is it? What is it? I thought that they destroyed Fordo and then that had been set back a year or forever.
But the nuclear reprocessing.
And now we're a week away.
Yeah, they destroyed Fordo and Natanz, the two main
enrichment sites.
But then there was this thing about, well, did they actually remove the enriched uranium before the sites were bombed? Because there was a build-up. And if you remember, I think it was Trump gave them 10 days and then he actually bombed them after 2 days. And that was probably because they were given some notice and they were moving it.
Yeah, you've also got to remember that, I mean, we don't know whether they managed to move any of that material, and it's, you know, it's hazardous and difficult and all that kind of thing. But it's actually quite small amounts of stuff. Yeah. You're not talking about, you know, huge, great big containerfuls of, you're talking about tens of kilograms of material, which, you know, has to have all its precautions. But that sort of thing is not that difficult to hide necessarily. So that, I think, is the question.
Jane, what about the Iranian people in all of this? We've kind of talked about the big geopolitics, but I'm thinking about them.
Yeah, and Faisal was talking about the economic knock-on. Well, of course, the big economic knock-on on all of this is on the people of Iran. And they're the ones who are suffering under sanctions. And that brought them out onto the streets. And that first brought Donald Trump out to say, you know, we're coming to your help. Help is coming.
On the way, yeah.
So I think it's interesting that we've seen protests start up again in the last 5 days or so, mainly in universities in Mashhad, in Tehran. So I think they're waiting. You know, they are holding protests, and we don't think we've seen the kind of crackdown we saw in early January by the regime. So I think everybody's playing a waiting game. You know, the protesters are protesting because it was economic circumstances, if you like, that forced them to that, because life was just unbearable in Iran. So everybody's playing a waiting game. The protests have sort of started, but they're not really being cracked down on. Meanwhile, the negotiations go on. But whatever happens, for the Iranian regime, getting some kind of sanctions relief is really important, because only that will put to rest, or at least for a while, or dampen down the public protest.
And Gary, Donald Trump, after his brief flurry on Truth Social supporting the protesters a couple of weeks ago, he's then gone completely quiet on that bit of the issue.
Yeah, and we've seen this before, I think, haven't we? We've seen the sort of focus of his justifications shift quite markedly. You know, in terms of Venezuela, it was, you know, at one point it was the sort of supply of drugs. At another point it was the lack of democracy. Then it became, you know, the need to sort of capitalize on Venezuelans' oil supplies for part of his sort of Don Road doctrine, you know, sort of dominating the Western Hemisphere. And I think you're seeing something similar in Iran. What is important, or what is motivating in his thinking, does seem to shift from time to time in the same situation. And that is something that I think they will see in the White House as a bit of a strength, because it keeps people guessing. And while they're guessing, your unpredictability can be a real bonus when it comes to these sorts of negotiations, not knowing how far you're prepared to go or what it is you really want. That is not something they would regard as a criticism here.
Right, we're going to stay focusing on Donald Trump, because this week he did his State of the Union, which is this big address he does to both houses of Congress. I was just checking the running order of the running time of my favourite film, Jurassic Park, is 2 hours 2 minutes. So Donald Trump did 15 minutes shorter than the first Jurassic Park. Gary, did you watch the whole thing?
I did.
I'm never sure how much this speech actually matters. I mean, we've all watched The West Wing. We're all political nerds. We know how much effort goes into writing the speech, how much time goes into analysing it. But is it something we should all give 1 hour 47 of our own brain space to?
Well, I mean, to the extent, Donald Trump, as we know, is out there every day. So, you know, he's being consumed, as it were, by the American public in various formats, clipped up through their feeds, whatever, on news bulletins every day of the week. The most visible and, if you like, accessible president there has really ever been. However, the thing I will say is about the State of the Union is that, you know, it does get, and I think, you know, we've got some early numbers, you know, potentially around 36 million people. Now, that is a way big chunk of voters, isn't it, in one go? And that is in itself an opportunity to try and move the needle on, you know, when you're in a two-party state like we are here, you know, a point or two in either direction can make a huge difference to your chances. And of course, Everyone has got their eye on the congressional elections at the end of the year, what we call the midterms here, where let's remind people, every single seat in the House of Representatives, all 435 of them, are up for election. The Republicans have a wafer-thin single-digit majority there, and a third of the Senate. So, that could absolutely change the nature of Donald Trump's last 2 years if the Democrats were to take back the House of Representatives. And the State of the Union this week is a sort of kickoff to that campaign to try and retain control of it.
And even if the speech is quite long and maybe you don't love it, it does always have a nice showbiz element to it, whoever is president. And this year it was the victorious American hockey team from the Winter Olympics who arrived in proper showbiz fashion. Let's have a little listen to that.
Our country is winning again. In fact, we're winning so much that we really don't know what to do about it. People are asking me, please, 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 Mr. President, we're winning too much. We can't take it anymore. We're not used to winning in our country. Until you came along, we're just always losing, but now we're winning too much. And I say, no, 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 you're going to win again. You're going to win big. You're going to win bigger than ever. And to prove that point, here with us tonight is a group of winners who just made the entire nation proud. The men's gold medal Olympic hockey team. Come on in.
I think they need to give that man a bigger microphone. Like it crackles when he talks. But Gary, I mean, does that whole jingoistic Team USA, go, 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 we're winning, the economy's amazing, does that actually feel the way America feels right now?
No, not largely. I mean, look, that sort of thing goes down pretty well for while it's happening. There was a bunch of theatrics like that. I'm not sure that hockey team stayed for the whole thing. Let's put it that way. It didn't look like it that they were staying for the whole thing. But the central point about this State of the Union and the thing that the Republicans have been telling the White House that they need to focus on is this famous word, affordability. How do Americans feel about the economic situation more generally, but also how they're doing in their everyday lives? And Donald Trump, says in the State of the Union, says, I inherited record inflation. Well, he didn't. He inherited 3% inflation. It's now down to 2.4%. And of course, that's not prices falling. That's prices just going up a little bit more slowly than they were. And despite, the fact that wages are also rising and, that growth is sort of starting to return, Americans don't feel it. And his message really was kind of, look, everything's fine, you just don't realize it. And that is not a persuasive thing that Republicans in vulnerable seats can take out to their districts and argue. It's not a message, really.
Faisal, give us a smart way of thinking about the American economy at the moment. Because I keep seeing things like, there's been a massive dip in the American stock market because AI has come along and everyone's realized, we're never going to have software anymore and Microsoft will go bust because AI will just do it all for you. You never have to buy another copy of Microsoft Word. What are some thoughts about how what's actually happening?
To be very reductive, there's two big things going on. You have and we'll get on to talking about the detail of this in a minute, but you have the massive uncertainty caused by constantly changing tariff policy, not just in the world, but also domestically in the US. If you're a supplier, all those ships coming across the Pacific to, for Walmart to supply Christmas, the pricing. I remember going out and seeing just how expensive it was and how they couldn't even price the toy catalogs, for example, in one US state. So you had that, but as it turned out, that didn't damage the US economy or cause as much inflation as quickly as you might think. That doesn't mean it isn't coming, but it hasn't come through the pipeline yet. So but you have that, but it wasn't great for certainty. But on the other hand, you have this astonishing kind of build out of artificial intelligence in terms of data centers. And the numbers are mind boggling, and a stock market boom that has fueled that. You're talking hundreds of billions. You're talking about more than the Manhattan Project that created nuclear power and the dot-com investment put together. You're doing staggering sums, and that has propelled the US stock markets. It has propelled the real economy too, and it's kept US growth going. But it's gone so far that people now just think it's going to pop at some point. It means that there'll still be many winners, and the AI change is very real, but you're going to see some fragility in markets. And people are very worried about that, who the losers are going to be. So these are the two competing forces. They kind of interact in complex ways. Like some of the other sides of the trade war, the Chinese, for example, are like, well, we've also got an AI industry that's doing quite well as well. It's totally fascinating. But I would say the key thing, if you're Donald Trump standing at State of the Union, is that you're like, hey, we're through this now. Everyone said, all the economic experts said that there was going to be a massive increase in the cost of imported goods that you were going to pay. It hasn't happened. See, I'm right. That's where we are right now. That might be a bit of a hostage to fortune.
The one thing I was going to say is that the interesting thing, Faisal talking about the data centers, that's, if you like, that's the trillionaires spending their money building, but it has a real knock-on effect on ordinary Americans, because the amount of energy that these data centers are going to need could drive up the price of energy in this country. And of course, that's one of the big pain points that American consumers, the ordinary Joe on Main Street will feel. So they're already trying to talk about ways of sort of making sure that, the tech industry pays for that kind of, that rise in prices. But it's a potential knock on right down to the lowest level.
And Jane, I remember chatting to you last year when you'd done the panorama about ahead of Trump's second state visit, well, actually when he was here, and that was then dominated by tariffs and trade. And I remember you were there in Scotland when Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, went to go and sign her deal with Donald Trump, for which she was quite criticised by a lot of people in Europe because she basically caved.
Well, everyone made a beeline to Donald Trump's golf course in Scotland. As Keir Starmer was there. I think he sat through a 90-minute speech by President Trump. I seem to remember
Fairly
sitting
short,
there thinking, gosh, how long is this? But obviously Gary sat through longer. And they all beat the path to, and she came out of nowhere. No one expected her to actually turn up, and she did. And she agreed this 15% tariff for Europe. And she was accused, as you say, at the time of caving. But, there was wild talk, 25% for Canada, 50% for Modi in India, because they'd taken Russian energy. Crazy sums were being talked about. So it seemed like a good deal, 15%. But of course, then now the Supreme Court finds this illegal. And, I suppose she's open to criticism too, that she made a deal that when in fact it was never going to be legal. But I think the whole tariff situation is so confused. I don't know where we are. Is there a 10% global tariff? Where are we now?
Faisal, tell us.
Faisal?
Well,
illegal, but still in place.
I told someone that the day they came in, the morning they came in, I went to bed having filed a report for Radio 4 saying it was going to be 15%, only to be woken up mid-morning, sort of, to be told, in fact, some report had come out of the customs agency saying it was, in fact, 10%, so I had to read in my report. Anyway, that's a minor impact of this. It is confusing. It is chaotic. Obviously stems back to the fact that they were deemed illegal, declared illegal, frankly, by the Supreme Court last week. 10% was what he originally said. Then he upped it to 15%. And then, lo and behold, it was 10%, with an idea that we'd move to 15%. Now, the interesting thing here is this some sort of tell? It'd be interesting to hear what Gary's view on this is, because I know that internationally, they were quite hopeful that it would stick at 10. And the difference between 10 and 15 is quite substantial for us in the UK and Australia and Japan, because we negotiated down to 10%. And so what was faced at the weekend was the prospect of the best allies that had done the most friendly deals.
Oh, so just to be clear,
US.
so if you'd done a deal like Keir Starmer did to get the tariffs down to 10%, the Supreme Court rules that all the tariffs are illegal. So then Trump does blanket 15 on everyone. The UK's would go basically
up to 15. So we would have been the worst hit. Now, that message was conveyed very clearly by people like Peter Kyle, the Trade Secretary, to Jameson Greer, his counterpart, and to Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary. And now, at this point, there's a black box, and then it ends up being 10, right? I don't know what cause and effect there is. Obviously, people in the British government say, well, of course, we leveraged our contacts. So the headline, indeed the report that I filed that we were going to be the worst hit, was no longer true. We weren't the worst hit. It's pretty much the same. But he still says, and he does have the power in the new deal that he has, Section 122, to put it up to 15% at any time. But there are still some quite interesting dilemmas here, which is this new power is temporary and it expires in 6 months' time. And it puts a lot of power in Congress's hands. Now, this is just asserting what would ordinarily be the case in trade policy. You deal with senators and congressmen, and they have sectoral interests, and you can play them off as a foreign state. The EU is very good at this. And I asked a UK government minister privately, so are we now going to go to Congress? How's that going to go? Is President Trump going to think is he going to be angry about this? Because even though it's normal, going to go around him. And they were like, we don't know. We don't know. We're just going to have to see how it goes. But they will feel vindicated by the fact that it didn't go up to 15, even though it might, and it's currently 10.
The suspicion, actually, after the Supreme Court came down with its judgment was that he didn't realise that he could go to 15%, which is why he said the 10% under, as Faisal said, the 122 provision. And that was his initial point. And that, as you say, 150 days before congressional approval. The thing I've noticed, though, in the last couple of months in the run-up to this, I think they were expecting to lose this. I think they, despite his anger on the day, etc., and all the kind of, your families will be ashamed of you, Supreme Court justices, I think they're expecting, because he's been saying for some time, we'll do it a different way. And, of course, there are different ways. The sectoral tariffs that were already in place on steel and aluminium and cars, they're not under the the IEPA law that was struck down. They're under national security provisions. There are other provisions on trade practices under 301 section. I'm sorry, all of these numbers, but there's another section of the Trade Act, 301, which he can bring in. Now, they're harder because they're slightly more targeted, and you have to go through a process of sort of investigation and reports and all that kind of stuff. But they have options, and those other routes, have stood the test of some court challenges. So whilst this sort of blanket thing is much easier to do, they do have other options on the table, which they are clearly going to try and use. And in a combination with threats to sort of even go higher on some of those other tariffs if countries start to unpick the bilateral deals they've already done.
Faisal, you have a very limited bingo window now to trade more numbers.
But it's total chaos, right? So you don't know if it's going to be 10, 15, or will it go up to 50, 75? Is Congress going to hit it? Are the courts even going to go after this 122 tariff? And so imagine trying to deal business here. If the central aim of this, which was what President Trump says, which is, there's a credible argument here, the rest of the world, are going to shift your factories to the US. If you've got no idea what the actual hit is, that is not going. It'll happen a bit, but it will not happen to the extent. And so his ability to point to, I've moved this factory because of my policy, is going to be really, really constrained because we've got no idea what the tariff's going to be.
Gary, thank you very much for watching the whole State of the Union and memorising all US trade law in the space of 1 week.
Great pleasure. Lovely to talk to you.
Jane, thanks for coming back.
Thank you for having me here.
And Faisal, always great to catch up.
Great to be here.
And that's all for this episode of Newscast. Apart from to say, we will be live across various BBC platforms on Friday morning at 7 o'clock, analysing the result of the Gorton and Denton by-election, whatever it is. Bye-bye.